In 1932, the Australian military declared war, not on a country, not on an army, on birds. Specifically on emus, large flightless birds that cannot fly, cannot strategize, and cannot, as far as anyone knows, read a map. The army brought machine guns, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, trained soldiers, and after weeks of fighting, the emus won. This is the true story of the Great Emu War, the only war in history where the side with the guns is the one that lost. To understand how this happened, we go back to the end of World War I. Australia had thousands of returning soldiers and not enough jobs for them. So the government had an idea: give them land. Huge stretches of Western Australia were carved into farms and handed to the veterans, who were told to grow wheat. There was just one problem. Much of this land was dry, marginal, and brutally hard to farm. But the veterans, being veterans, rolled up their sleeves and tried anyway. Then came the Great Depression. Wheat prices collapsed. The farmers, already struggling, were now growing a crop that was barely worth harvesting. The government promised them subsidies to stay afloat, subsidies that conveniently never quite arrived. Morale was low, debt was high, and then, as if the universe wanted to test them just a little more, 20,000 emus showed up. Every year after breeding season, emus migrate inland searching for water. Normally they would find dry scrubland, but this time they found something far better: freshly cleared farmland, full of crops and, crucially, water tanks built by the farmers. To an emu, this was paradise. 20,000 of them flooded into the Campion district, trampling fences, devouring wheat, and tearing gaps in the fencing that let rabbits pour in behind them. It was a disaster with feathers. The farmers had had enough. Many of them were ex-soldiers, so they did what old soldiers do. They went to the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, and asked for the army. And not just any help. They asked for machine guns. Astonishingly, Pierce said yes. He reasoned the emus would make good target practice. The operation would produce great newsreel footage, and it might just help the desperate farmers. The press would later nickname him the Minister for the Emu War. And so, in November 1932, the Great Emu War officially began. The Australian Expeditionary Force consisted of exactly 3 men: Major Meredith in command, 2 soldiers to operate the guns, their arsenal, 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Their enemy, 20,000 emus who had no idea a war had been declared and would not have cared if they did. The plan was simple: find the emus, line up the guns, and mow them down. Reality had other plans. On the first attempt, the soldiers spotted a group of about 50 emus, but the birds were out of range. The farmers tried to herd them toward the guns, and for a moment it worked, until the emus did something nobody expected. They split up. Instead of one big target, they scattered into dozens of tiny groups, sprinting off in every direction at once. The soldiers opened fire anyway. A few emus fell, but most simply kept running, and here is the incredible part. Emus are fast, reaching nearly 50 kilometers an hour, and they are astonishingly tough. Bullets that would drop a larger animal seemed to barely slow them down. Witnesses described emus running on after being hit several times. The machine guns, it turned out, were almost useless against a sprinting, zigzagging emu. A few days later, Meredith tried an ambush. He positioned the guns near a dam where more than 1,000 emus had gathered to drink. This was the moment. The soldiers waited, took careful aim, and fired into the enormous flock. And then, after only about a dozen birds, the gun jammed. By the time it was clear, the emus had melted away into the scrub. A dozen out of 1,000. Undeterred, the army got creative. They bolted a machine gun onto the back of a truck, reasoning they could simply chase the emus down. It was a bold plan. It was also a terrible one. The truck was far too slow to catch the birds, and the ride across rough farmland was so violently bumpy that the gunner could not aim at anything. The chase ended when the truck crashed into a fence, and in one telling, an emu got tangled in the steering on the way down. By now, something had become embarrassingly clear. The emus were winning. They even seemed organized. Observers noticed that each mob of emus appeared to have a leader, a big black-plumed bird that stood tall and kept watch while the others fed, sounding the alarm at the first sign of soldiers. Major Meredith, half joking and half in genuine admiration, began comparing the birds to a military force. Meredith's verdict became legendary. "If we had a military division," he said, "with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns." He marveled with the invulnerability of tanks. He had been sent out to shoot some birds. He came back sounding like a man who had fought an elite army and lost. After about a week, the results were tallied. The army had fired roughly 2,500 rounds of ammunition. The confirmed emu death toll, depending on who you ask, somewhere between a few dozen and a few hundred against a flock of 20,000. This was not a victory. Word reached Parliament, where politicians gleefully mocked the entire affair. And so the military quietly packed up and withdrew. The Great Emu War had been lost. But the farmers were not laughing. The emus were still destroying their crops, so they begged for the army to come back. Astonishingly, it did. Meredith was sent out again later in November, and the operation dragged on into December. This time he claimed better results, reportedly around 100 emus a week. But even then, for every emu that fell, thousands more kept right on eating. The land, quite simply, belonged to the birds. So how do you actually stop 20,000 emus? Not with machine guns. In the end, the government did something far less cinematic. They brought back the bounty system, paying ordinary people for every emu they culled. And it worked. In a single 6-month stretch, hundreds of thousands of emus were claimed. Later, farmers turned to enormous exclusion fences to keep the birds out for good. The problem that had defeated the army was solved in the end by paperwork and fencing. Today, the emu is a protected native species in Australia and even appears on the nation's coat of arms. The Great Emu War is remembered not as a tragedy, but as one of the most gloriously absurd military operations ever attempted. The time a modern army, armed with machine guns, marched out to fight a flock of flightless birds and came home defeated. So the next time someone tells you that humans are the dominant species on Earth, gently remind them. In 1932, the emus went to war with Australia, and the emus won.